Welcome, everyone, to the launch of NLI USA's Signature Speaker Series. I'm Adina Canefield, the Executive Director of NLI USA. This series and the event today is inspired by the core collections of the National Library of Israel, and it reflects our commitment to approaching the collections in creative ways that bring the collections to life and make them relevant to contemporary issues of our world today. This is also about bringing to you our board leadership of NLI USA to have them share their insights along with the experts and curators of the National Library of Israel. And frankly, this is also about publicly making a statement that NLI USA is here and we are committed to growing the presence of the library in the United States, as well as, of course, throughout the world. You all will have an ability to pose questions, and I invite you to pose them in the chat of the Zoom at the bottom. Now I have the honor of introducing our moderator today, Jack Liu. Jack served as the 76th United States Secretary of the Treasury from 2013 to 2017. Previously, he served as White House Chief of Staff to President Barack Obama and Director of the Office of Management and Budget in both the Obama and Clinton administrations. He has also served as Deputy Secretary of State and as Principal Domestic Policy Advisor to House Speaker Tip O'Neill, in addition to holding a variety of private sector and nonprofit roles. Jack is currently a managing partner at Lindsay Goldberg and a member of the faculty at the School of International Affairs at Columbia. And most importantly for me, Jack is co-president of NLI USA. I know that you will enjoy hearing from Jack along with all of our exemplary panelists today. Jack? I'm turning it over to you, Jack.
I had to go off of mute, I apologize. Thanks, Adina, and it's terrific to be with all of you here today. I'm delighted to serve as moderator for what I hope will be a very interesting conversation where we try to bring together Sir Isaac Newton, COVID-19, and the National Library of Israel. I'm pleased to serve along with my friend David Makovsky as co-president of the NLI USA board. And it's something that we both do because the library is a treasure. It brings together the history and the heritage of Israel and of the Jewish people, and it gives it creates a place to preserve, record, and transmit so much of our tradition and history. NLI USA is committed to bringing the work of the library into the lives of Jewish and non-Jewish people worldwide, including in the United States. In the coming years, through digitization and expansive thinking around 21st century libraries, we envision the library of having a big impact on the Jewish and cultural landscape in the United States. And today's conversation is a step in making that happen. I'd like to start by introducing our panelists today, David Agus and Stefan Litt. Dr. David Agus is my colleague on the NLI USA board, and he's a professor of medicine and engineering at the University of Southern California's Keck School of Medicine and Viterbi School of Engineering. He's the founding director and CEO of the Lawrence J. Ellison Institute for Transformative Medicine of USC, and is a medical oncologist and international leader in new technologies and approaches for personalized healthcare. Dr. Agus serves in leadership roles at the World Economic Forum and other significant organizations around the world. He's a CBS News contributor who's been very active during this pandemic, explaining what's going on to the American people. And he's an accomplished author of 3 books, The End of Illness, A Short Guide to a Long Life, and The Lucky Years, How to Thrive in the Brave New World of Health, all New York Times and international bestsellers. Dr. Stefan Litt is the curator for general humanities and is an archival expert at the National Library of Israel, where he's in charge of European language holdings, including the papers of Martin Buber, Stefan Zweig, Max Brod, Franz Kafka, and others. He received his PhD in pre-modern Jewish history from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and a postdoctoral degree from Graz University in Austria. He was a researcher and visiting professor at the universities of Erfurt and Dusseldorf in Germany, Graz in Austria, as well as Jerusalem and Bar Ilan in Israel. He's published on the history of early modern Jewry and on modern Jewish archival collections. So, Stefan, why don't we begin today's conversation with you? And could you begin by telling us a bit about the Newton Papers and what they're doing at the National Library of Israel and what they reveal? And if you can, maybe open a little window for us into some of the things that he might have been writing around the time of the bubonic plague epidemic between 1665 and 1666. Stefan?
Yes, right. Thank you, and hello to everyone. And thank you for giving me the honor to be the first speaker in this new series, and I'm really happy about that. And also happy to share our collections with you, which are the theological papers of Sir Isaac Newton. So you may rightfully ask why they are stored in Jerusalem, because this is a place which really does not connect to Isaac Newton's active years in general. So this is going back to this very distinguished gentleman, Abraham Shalom Yehuda, who was an Orientalist, Jerusalem born. He studied and taught in Europe, in Germany, in Spain, in Great Britain, and later in the United States, and was also an ardent collector of old manuscripts, Oriental manuscripts, Jewish manuscripts, but also of historical documents. And he simply could almost never resist when something important and beautiful showed up on the market at auctions, and he bought them right away. So he bequeathed a number of roughly 7,000 sheets in Isaac Newton's handwriting on theological matters with his last will to the National Library. It came to the National Library in 1969, and since then, of course, attracted a lot of interest and audience worldwide, both researchers and wide audience. So we are very proud to have these papers with us, because it's not just a very important part of our collection, going back to one of the most influential persons in the history of science in the 17th century and the 18th century as well. But also it's one of the biggest and most important and oldest special collections that we have in the National Library in the field of general humanities. So proudly we were able to submit this collection to be registered in the list of the UNESCO program Memory of the World, and it was accepted in 2015 together with the alchemical papers stored in Cambridge University Library. So we are definitely on that list, and this is of course also quite important for us. So what's in these writings? We know a lot about Isaac Newton, that he was a brilliant thinker, and he made so many findings in the field of physics, science, mathematics, and astronomy, and so on and so forth. So why on earth theology? He was one of the typical philosophers, which were called in those days the men, or mostly men, who were thinking in so many different ways and were active in so many fields of knowledge, and trying to piece it together to one understanding, to a whole picture. So he was very busy with researching the history of ancient societies, ancient cultures. For instance, this is an example. He has written this treatise, The Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms, Amended. We will see that later on as well. And others are very elaborated texts about the Jerusalem temple and the tabernacle. So how was it created? And that was important to him because he believed that the temple would be the scenery of the apocalypse, according to the book of Revelations, the last book of the New Testament. So we have a very modest drawing of the temple square, which you can see on this document. There are others in better manuscripts, but unfortunately we do not have 100% of the theological writings. We have a good share, definitely more than 50%. I think it comes up to roughly 70% of all the surviving theological papers. In addition to that, he was very, very much intrigued by calculating the end of time. And this is one of the two documents that we have in that collection, reporting about his understanding that in the year 2060, the end of time will happen and the kingdom of God will commence. So that means the Messianic age will start in 2060. Most of us can lean back calmly. That is not really important to us anymore. So, and in addition, of course, there are many texts about the apocalypse, like this one, various lessons on the apocalypse in Latin. He was fluent in Latin, of course, also quite well educated in ancient Greek and even in Hebrew, by the way. This is one of the very few texts which is dated. Most of them have been apparently written between 1670 and 1720. That makes 50 years of his active lifetime. That's quite a long period. And it's amazing to see how attracted he was over such a long period of his life. Another text, quite important, is that one, Considerations about Rectifying the Julian Calendar from 1699. We have to understand that England then, around 1700, was still led by the old Julian calendar, which is, as we know, not as exact as the Gregorian calendar, and that goes back to the struggle between the Catholic and the Reformation Church and the Protestant Church. Protestants were reluctant towards this Catholic invention of Gregorian calendar, and indeed England only in the mid-18th century followed the new, not so new calendar going back to Pope Gregory. And Newton was concerned about that because he understood quite perfectly why this Julian calendar is not as good as it could be, and also made some elaborations on that. So we know that the most important scientific writings have been published by Newton during his lifetime, but interestingly, the theological papers have been just published after his death. The one on the left-hand side, The Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms, Amended, I mentioned that earlier, was printed in 1728 for the first time, a couple of years after his death. And the other one, Observations upon the Prophecies of Daniel, and so on, was printed in 1733. So let's conclude. Isaac Newton was one of the universalists, philosophers of his time, and being active in so many different fields of knowledge, not just science, but also theology, alchemy, which was chemistry of the times then. And he tried to actually apply the exact methods of science in, if you wish to say, humanities, in his interpretations of the Bible, ancient texts, in order to compute frequent cycluses of human culture. And that makes him one of the very first people who actually tried to do that in his time. So, and also going back to the Anni Mirabilis, which were called the years 1665, 1666, when Isaac Newton was still a very young man. He made his most brilliant thinkings in the field of science, in the field of gravity, and all for what he is famous today. And we may see that he was surely intrigued because these years were really hard years for the people living not just in England, but also in other places in Europe and worldwide because of the bubonic plague. And why he was so much attracted to the apocalypse and thinking about that may also go back to those horrible years where he was able to sit in his quiet home in the countryside and made such great inventions. Jack?
Thanks so much, Stefan. Now we're going to try to bring David in. And an interesting theme in the Newton papers is, not surprisingly, the idea that it's important to measure and define novel and undefined phenomena. And the differences between observed and revealed measurement inform our understanding and challenge previous perceptions. David, how would you relate the constant search for order and measurement to efforts that are now underway to understand and combat COVID, when our best scientific efforts must contend with limited information and rapidly evolving understanding?
Yeah.
While we're adjusting, maybe I'll just say something I was going to say a little bit later in the session, and we'll come back to David and to Stefan. As somebody who looks at these issues from the perspective of policymaking and relies on science, the fact that scientific knowledge is incomplete is almost always one of the conditions of making policy. And it's why it's so important to maintain research even when there's not a crisis, be able to respond quickly to changing information. And it's one of the reasons why international cooperation is so important, because when you're dealing with a transnational threat like a pandemic, there's absolutely never going to be a case when the problem, knowledge, and solution will reside in just one country. And the challenge for policymakers who are working with the best information that they have is that it will keep changing. And there's a need to make decisions and then to explain when you have different understanding and the policy has to change direction. And all that requires deep credibility. And science is the way you gain the credibility. If you base your policy on the best science you have, it's the job of a policymaker to adapt the policy as the learning changes and to communicate with the public why what you knew had to be reconsidered. It's also, I think, important that we not be in the mode of just thinking you can respond to a crisis like a pandemic in the moment. And I will defer to David on the science of this, but the idea of developing a vaccine in 1 year would have been impossible if there hadn't been research going on for a long, long time before that, developing the capability of using something like messenger RNA to deliver something to our bodies to produce the ability to fight a virus. It's one of the reasons why coming out of the crisis, it's going to be so important that we continue to maintain a focus on understanding these things better and not lose our focus when the crisis ends. I guess I would just say one more thing. This has been a kind of unique crisis in the sense that the solution to dealing with a medical crisis was to create an economic crisis. And it's something that I've certainly never experienced. I'm not sure on a world scale anyone has experienced. It goes back to the question of credibility and transparency. If you're going to make scientific medical decisions that cause real pain and real dislocation, it has to be rooted in the best understanding you have of the science. And it has to include the ability to explain why, when things changed, it didn't mean that you were wrong in the first place, but that you're adapting as quickly as is possible in a world of expanding understanding. I hope I went on long enough, David, to give a chance to resolve the issue. Let me stop now and see if David can jump back in.
Jack, I think you're going to have to turn to Stefan while.
Okay. Stefan, you know, the exposure that most of us have to Newton is through his laws of physics, you know, the range of his papers, you know, and his efforts to understand kind of natural phenomena and theological questions is much broader than at least my own exposure. I know when I was at the library for the first time and I held some of the Newton papers, it was an extraordinary sense of touching history to hold a piece of paper that Isaac Newton had written in his own hand. What aspects of his papers do you think most resonate with our modern life and times? And if you can speculate, how do you think he would react to our current understanding of the world around us?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's absolutely right. So first of all, I think that he would very much appreciate the role that sciences have taken in public knowledge and in public conscience. Okay, so that is something that was definitely not going on when he was very actively working at Cambridge University. Of course, in these very few small academic bubbles, thinking was always welcomed, but this active role that we discuss right now today, that you just turn on the news and you have the latest knowledge about a new vaccine developed somewhere in the world and how it works and how effective it is and so on and so forth. This is something which was, of course, not working in his days. Secondly, I think that he would really not be able to understand why we tend today in our society to separate disciplines of knowledge, which is the reason for it is that in the meantime, we do know so many things that hardly anyone can really imagine to know everything which is knowledgeable in the world. But of course, it is something which was much more easy back then. But as I said before, that's not so surprising, actually, that he was dealing with theology as well, because for him, it was one big world and one big topic that had to be faced by all different angles and all possible ways of understanding. And I was really fascinated by reading a book about Newton's life and his thoughts, and right in the foreword it was mentioned, yes, he was a brilliant scientist and a good thinker, but let's not forget he was not an enlightened person yet. He was far away from that. Okay, so he did believe very much in the absolute trueness of the Holy Scripture, and that what the church authorities are saying is right in a way. So, and he didn't argue with that, but he tried to bring in this kind of knowledge of believing into the world of sciences. And maybe some of us would like to smile a bit about this approach, but this is how many people saw it in those days. He was not an exemption at all, of course. And third, I think he would also not really understand why it's so hard for us to go into seclusion for a while, as he did in those 2 years of the bubonic plague, when he was just almost alone, sitting in his home and thinking and watching nature and thinking again about phenomena he was seeing all around. And he had plenty of times, not distracted by his duties in university, to elaborate so many important understandings. And I think this is what we all lack today, that we do not have time to be just 1 hour totally with ourselves, without these smartphones, computers, news, noise whatsoever. And I think he was in a much better situation back then.
Well, just note that even in modern times, people find ways to create that hour. Former Secretary of State George Shultz, who just passed away, was famous for carving an hour or two a day when he closed his door and he just read and wrote and thought.
Right.
For those of us who try to keep Shabbat does that for us. It's a day when you cut off from other parts of the world and have more time to think. I think the pandemic has done it on a multicultural basis, where we've all had to find that kind of way to deal with quiet. David, I think your sound is fixed, so we'd love to have you jump back in.
I apologize. It seemed that I was being controlled from elsewhere on my sound. It didn't have control, but now I have some control. So technology is not always perfect. What I was trying to allude to is that, we've learned on the fly with this virus, and we've actually followed as we went. And it's the observations, the simple things that have actually given us the insight into this virus. This morning, I was talking to the United Kingdom, where they're getting their first data back. They're vaccinating differently than we are. Here, we're giving a little bit of vaccine to every community in the country. And most places are at 10, 20, 25% at most. In the United Kingdom, they say, where is the virus the highest? And let's saturate those areas with vaccine. And because of those observations, we could start to learn how the vaccine worked. And what we're seeing is dramatic falls in the virus in those communities. What we're seeing is that whether you have a variant or not, you're responsive. Early on, the media had made these proclamations that, well, you have 60% less antibodies with the South African variant or the UK variant. And what they forgot was that the majority of the response to this virus was from T cells. And so while the statement was correct they made, it was irrelevant in that T cells were giving the dominant response. And we're seeing profound protection in these studies. And it really is encouraging. If we can roll the vaccine out here, we're going to do well. I helped put together the Israeli vaccination program. And just the notion, that they were able to slowly roll this out decade by decade, not complicated like we did. If you do this and you do this, most states overthought the regulations. And so, if you were as a kid able to get a Springsteen ticket online, and knew how to go on your computer over and over again, you got a reservation. But by doing things simply, they've had a remarkable rollout and seeing a precipitous fall in the virus. I go back to the Newton times, and I learned so much by looking at what he wrote and who he was. I'm a cancer doc, and I got thrown into this COVID mess, at Davos this year, the World Economic Forum, when somebody from China, a colleague, thrust an iPhone in my face and showed me a hallway with people literally littered, lying down, barely able to breathe. And this was a hospital in Wuhan. And what you quickly realize is that the disciplines required to make an impact here were observation and the ability to synthesize data. Newton made observations and synthesized data across multiple different domains. And his contributions, whether it be to calculus or gravity or others, were profound, and he was a polymath. We have become so focused in our world today. My domain is how this molecule does this, and this is what I focus on, that we forgot the big picture. And most things in the world are complex emergent systems. They're not reductionist. And so with reductionist views, unfortunately, you make many mistakes. And we saw that with the World Health Organization. Many of the CDC proclamations were very reductionist in how they look at things. And so the ability to take a step back and look at the big picture was something that he did and many others never could. And it was alluded to when he sat in nature during those years of the bubonic plague, when he left university, some of his most profound observations came. We're all here sitting on Zoom, right? Jacob, you're in 2 dimensions. My brain keeps looking at you, trying to find that 3rd dimension. And it's exhausting to my brain. Our brains were designed that we were out in nature and pattern recognition, right? If you could, go hunting or foraging, and made your way back to the village, you survived. And so he respected that and sat in nature and made some of his biggest observations. I think we can all learn from that. And wherever we are, go back to nature and sit there and make these broad thinking observations, and hopefully make some conclusions that are important to our life and potentially others.
So David, as you look towards the end of this stage of the crisis, which with the vaccinations, hopefully we're able to do. I know when I last served in government, we didn't think it was a question of if there'd be a pandemic, it was a question of when. How going forward do we take the experience that the world has gone through in the last year and be better able to be resilient and responsive going forward in the future?
It's a great question. You know, we had 8 near misses over the last decade. H1N1 had a 60% mortality rate and was a miss. But if they had hit, we would have been much more devastated than we were with the current virus. And so we're now, for the first time, really developing global efforts on surveillance and understanding. It's the notion that we're all in this together. You know, if somebody has something anywhere in the world, they can get on a plane and be anywhere hours later. So last week I spoke to the president, and what we were talking about is the idea that we have to form an international consortium to be able to look at surveillance of this virus, surveillance of other viruses, use our satellites to actually look for markers of where to deploy molecular technology. And every country have a sovereign stripe, which means the data are their own, but in a privacy protected way, we can pool that and use that together. And Jacob, like you, and I think everybody, I've had so many interactions over these last months with people all around the world, working with scientists together so that we can, as one, really fight this. I mean, because we're all in this together. Science is international. This virus doesn't care what your religion is, what your weight is, where you live, what your skin color is. The virus is non-discriminatory in that way. And so we have to treat science and data in that way. We're in an unparalleled time in the world where we can collect data. The challenge now is to respect privacy and to be able to use that data to protect all of us, to use the remarkable advances in computing, machine learning, and AI to be able to improve each of our own health and also to focus here and then to be prepared, right? We got good at making vaccines, as you can see now. What we didn't do well is manufacturing. There's been no innovation in manufacturing of vaccines in 3 decades. Well, obviously that we need to work on. Some of the supply chain management issues here, we would go through simulations every year at the World Economic Forum of what could happen if a pandemic hit, and you probably went through the same. And everything we thought could happen to the simulation did, yet we were still unprepared. Right. So we need to figure out new ways to deal with that and really stand up with leadership. To get normative behavior change, you need leadership. And what we saw during this pandemic sorely lacking was leadership in the health domain. There is 31% of the world economy is health and food, yet I challenge you to name many leaders in this space. There aren't. And so when you look for a dictum to do mass work or vaccine safe, et cetera, we're never really sure who to trust because you can find anything on this thing called the internet that says anything you want if you look hard enough. So the challenge is to get the leadership so we can do the right thing.
Yeah, I guess I would add that it's definitely a challenge to science, but it's equally a challenge to governance and the ability to respond in quick time frames to challenges that you didn't fully understand. I remember when Ebola struck in Africa, before we even knew what the treatments were, we knew it had to be contained where it was, or the scale of the problem would grow. And that kind of fell into 2 policy areas. One, if you wanted people to stay in a country, they had to be able to expect to get treatment in that country. Otherwise, the natural human instinct would be to just try to cross a border into a place where you could get treatment. The other was you had to protect the economy in the country. And we actually worked with the IMF in the early days to shore up the economies in the countries that were hit so that you wouldn't have more of an economic collapse that would have driven more people to leave the country and spread the infection. I look at the way the world reacted to COVID. I didn't see a lot of that kind of lateral thinking and international approach to dealing with the problem. And I guess one of the things that I worry about, and David, you're more expert in this than I, once everyone is vaccinated in the developed countries, Israel is ahead of the world and doing quite well. But the United States and Europe will catch up, and we'll get to the point where we're well vaccinated. What are the stakes if the vaccination rate in poor countries is not catching up? What does that mean in terms of the ability to truly control the variations of the virus we'll face in the future?
I remember during Ebola, I got a phone call. It's one of the greatest phone calls, or the worst I've ever received. It was from Shimon Peres, the president of Israel, as well as the Pope together. And it's a hell of a combination if you think about it. And the reason they called was all the remarkable things you were talking about. Many people in Western Africa did not trust people from the United States, from Europe. And so while we had great ideas and wanted to give help, there was a lack of a trust. They thought we would steal their body parts, that we were trying to inflict things. And there wasn't that in him trust. And they wanted to put an organization for that trust. And I think we see certainly the need for that now. But the notion of, when we're vaccinated as the United States, we will have enough vaccines for adults in May. And the president announced that. And it is remarkable. The problem is Canada has almost no vaccines. The European Union has almost no vaccines. Africa has limited vaccines. And this is a global problem. The more the virus changes, mutates, the more it changes. Over 1 million years of evolution, our genome changed 1%. A virus can change 1% in a day. So the more virus there is, the more aggressive over time the virus can be, and more it can elude the vaccines and other things. So this is a global issue. There are efforts, something called COVAX, to distribute vaccines across the world, but they're now being used as diplomatic means. Israel, traded, for prisoners vaccines, through Russia. We're seeing other countries now that have India was making most of the vaccines for the continent of Africa. And they just said, hey, listen, we're not going to export them to Africa. We're actually going to give them to our own country and our neighboring countries instead of the contracts that we had. And so we're seeing now people step up, and a lot of nationalism with regard to these vaccines. So a lot of the efforts going on now is to go around that, to try to explain that the first goal is to vaccinate the vulnerable around the globe. The second goal is to enable the economy around the globe. The third goal is the rest of the people around the globe. And to try to pull them together in a global sense is going to be critical. Some companies stepped up. Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca are making no profit on their vaccine. They have each contributed to billions of doses around the globe. Companies like Pfizer and Moderna are making staggering profit on their vaccine and contributing very little to the global supply. And that has to change. It is a privilege to be a pharmaceutical company. It is not a right. And they are beholden to the citizens of the globe, not just their shareholders. And that's a new way of looking at companies also in corporate responsibility. Getting Merck to vaccinate the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was not an easy task, but it's what's going to enable us to have enough supply by May rather than several months later. And several months equals tens to 100,000s of lives in our country and elsewhere.
So, Stefan, going back to you and to the library, help us think about how an institution like a library, a place where knowledge is stored and shared, and conversations can be encouraged, how it plays a role in dealing with the challenges that we face today and in the future.
I think our role is definitely in keeping the cultural knowledge and the cultural memory of events like that, and thinking back, David may correct me, of course, because he has much better knowledge and insight in that, but I think that the last pandemic, which is known to most of us worldwide, was a Spanish influenza a bit more than 100 years ago. And I discussed it with many friends of mine here and elsewhere, and we were asking, listen, do you have any memories in your family? Because your grandparents, great-grandparents most likely did survive that. Is it a family story? No, it isn't. There's hardly anything in memory about that at all. And I remember a year ago when the actual pandemic came up, so historians were researching and said, yeah, we had something similar 100 years ago. Look how few we actually know about that. Okay, so, and I think this is the role that the library can take also in these times. First of all, offering events like we do just in order to raise the spirit a bit. And it works perfectly. That's our experience. And secondly, we actively collect materials created worldwide in Jewish communities reflecting COVID-19. So how do they react? How did they try to offer social services in the communities? How do they try to bring up cultural events in digital format and so on? How did they advertise it? And whenever there's something printed or even electronic sources, we try to collect them in order to keep that memory alive. Let's hope for a very long period for the next generations.
It is really rather fascinating. I know we were commenting in our family that our parents grew up at the time of the Spanish flu, and certainly our grandparents, and none of us could remember any stories about it. It didn't prepare us psychologically to deal with something like this, to know that the generation just before us had gone through it. And I actually think we would have been better served if it wasn't just in circles of medical science and policy that people understood both the history and the risk, but that if it was more broadly understood. Now, people can't live with a cloud of fear in every day, and that's the challenge. But I think a library does provide a place to collect those stories. And if there was a set of memories of the experience of the Spanish flu, it probably would be a bestseller today. Adina, we've asked folks who have questions to put them in the message box, and I know you've been following it. So I'll turn it to you to perhaps ask our panel some of the questions.
Great. I think just as a perfect segue to your most recent comment, Jack, I have a question from Maxwell in the audience. This I think is best for you, David. He says, sort of playing off what you asked earlier, he said, in this age of reduction and siloed learning, what are the best strategies that we can all take to have a broader view of world problems? This is a young, happen to know this Maxwell, and a young up and coming leader wants to have that kind of broader view. What can young future leaders do to view things more universally and holistically, and who are good examples of this mindset?
You know, when I look at the United States and what it's done over the last several decades, one of the reasons it's been dominant, and one of the reasons Israel is now dominant in the technology world, is that we're given broad educations. And so, you know, it's the notion that not going to professional school early, but getting exposed to many other things. As a university student, to identify your weakness, and those are the areas that you want to take courses in, not just your strength. And I think that is tremendously powerful and important. And then for people in different domains, whether they be an expert in finance, an expert in medicine, an expert in humanities, to start to be more reaching out and educating. You know, I do, television for the reason of education. A man, a Holocaust survivor knocked on my door one day when I was at Sloan Kettering in New York. And I looked up and it was Time Man of the Year that year, Andy Grove, who was then CEO of Intel. And I was like, oh my gosh, Dr. Grove, what are you doing here? And he came by because we had made a discovery in the form of cancer and he wanted to talk about it. And as we're sitting there, he looked at me and goes, you're a horrible public speaker. And I go, why does that matter? I'm doing good science. He goes, no, your role is much as important is to educate as it is to do science, and they're together. And he actually scheduled several hundred talks for me every day on the way home from work to force me to become a better public speaker, because it was my role and my obligation. And we've evolved to a point in the world where many in the academic community are focused on their research and not on the education component to it. And I think it's going to be critical is that we're all important, integral to have transparency, to be a role, an educator, and to be a public speaker, because all together, it's a lot more powerful. In my institute, art is a big part of it. And I, was so excited because there's a sculpture that's in the museum in Rome of a remarkable guy named Edward Jenner vaccinating his 5-year-old son. And the story goes that he saw women milking cows and they would get pox on their arm. And this was the era of smallpox, where everyone who got smallpox died. And when you took care of someone with smallpox, you would die. And these women never got ill, and they could take care of people with smallpox. So he went to the King of England and goes, you know, I want to inject myself with the pus from the arm of these women and try to transfer their protection. The king said, you are crazy. That night, the king had a dream. And the dream was the King Solomon dream, where two women went to King Solomon and said, this is my baby. And King Solomon said, I'm going to rip the baby in half. And the real mother said, you take the baby. And that's how King Solomon knew who the mother was. So the king called him back and said, Jenner, you inject your 5-year-old son. It's the only child you had. I know how hard it was to have a child, and you did. Well, the important thing to me about this sculpture is that number 2 through 11 who got the vaccine were the king and the royal family. In order to get normative behavior change, you know, show leadership. And to me, it's what the king did to get science out there by being the second person to get what became the first vaccine that's so powerful. I had written to this museum in Rome and actually asked them to make a copy of the sculpture because it was so meaningful about the role of educating. And they said, no, it's one of our national treasures. Well, midway through COVID, we had helped the European Union, and they called me up and they're gifting that sculpture. So we'll actually have that sculpture here to show together with, we're gonna, you know, and I think very strongly, I want to educate people about the remarkable things that are happening at the National Library of Israel. So the Isaac Newton papers are going to come here to Los Angeles, and we're going to exhibit them and try to put his writings in the context of science in today's world.
Just to put David's example from history into contemporary terms, when I was at the State Department, I was in Kano, Nigeria, at a time when there was a real urgent need to vaccinate children against polio. And it was an almost surreal setting with rings where people would genuflect to all of the castes above them until you got to the center ring with the highest caste. The emir stood up and he said, I just had my grandchildren take this vaccine. Everybody needs to take this vaccine. It was the same lesson as the King of England. You lead by example, not by power.
Great. I have segueing back to you, Stefan. A really interesting question here. 350 years from now, what documents from our time at the library do you think people will be looking at to understand the pandemic of 2020?
Wow, that's a great question. So maybe let's hope that people will forget as easily as we forgot about the Spanish flu, and they are not really keen to know anything about that. But our task is really to be prepared in order to offer something for the generations to come, you know. And this is so hard today because we actually live in a time where digital data is running worldwide in amounts that we hardly could imagine in the past. And our task as a cultural institution preserving documents is also to find good and proper ways how to preserve at least a certain share of everything that we are producing in huge quantities day by day. So first of all, we have to make sure that it's somehow preserved, something which is not real, which has no physical expression. That's so hard today. And also there is a number of things, and I reminded that earlier, that we do collect flyers and posters and what's on from Jewish communities. We also have to make sure that they will survive for the next generations. But how exactly will that go and work? We cannot really predict. Most of us are historians and not prophets.
I challenge you, Stefan. I mean, in my most recent book, I actually put pages from the London City Hospital where they cataloged the number of cases of the bubonic plague in the city, and they show how up and when it down and how public health measures change it. They had a literally writing a log every day of the number of deaths and where they were and what happened that week within the city. And it changed and created the field of public health. Well, for the first time with an ongoing pandemic, we're vaccinating a country, which is Israel, and all of the records of what's happening are literally, again, being written down. I will help you get those records and put them in the National Library of Israel because it's a story that has to be told. It's the story of, you know, one country responding and responding rather late with a very poor initial response to it, as evidenced by what happened, you know, to the citizens in Israel, and now having probably the most dominant response. But that has to be preserved, and I hope will be.
I totally agree with you, yes.
as a follow-up to that, we have a question more specifically, how can the average person help in that documentation and collection process? And I know, you touched on the ephemera collection that the library has, but if you could just respond to this person's comment about contributing to the chain of memory that the library needs.
I think, first of all, we also have to try in our very own and private field, what can we do in order to preserve some memory about ourselves for future, And in let's say 100 years ago, it was quite easy because people were writing letters to each other. So we do write emails, and sometimes, or very often, we send messages on the phone and whatever. So maybe we should try to think what can be preserved out of these materials, maybe for later generations. And every time we are changing our computer and replacing it by a new one, we are actually actively working for cultural destruction, because we do not keep what's on the old computer, many of us. Not all, but this is something that maybe should be in our mind somehow, to make any effort in order to keep something from us, even if it's a digital expression, and that's challenging. That's not easy.
But I mean, remember, these papers we're talking about, the Newton papers, which are staggering and change how we view history. They came from an ordinary citizen who just had his eye open and found them and gave them to the National Library of Israel. So I really think all of us are scavengers, in a sense, to look for things that can preserve ways of thinking, preserve ideas, preserve papers that may be beneficial to the Jewish people.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, something that we've thought about is, how do you make sure for your children and grandchildren that the year doesn't just become a dark memory, since there were moments of light in a dark year. And our project, if we ever get to it, is going to be to put together a Snapfish book, which, yes, we'll have pictures of everybody in masks and being alone at their computers, but it'll also have some of the moments of the year where, like Newton in his privacy, people discover things about themselves. It's one of those projects that one can commit to, but then you have to execute on. And ultimately, the challenge is to culturally save them collectively.
That's right, yes.
Segueing a little bit, Jack, I think this is a good question for you. This is from Gary. This is an issue that should really unite the world. He's speaking about the pandemic, but it hasn't on so many levels. What suggestions do you have for unifying us around both the research and in addressing this issue, and really seizing on this as a universal opportunity together?
Well, I think we have opportunities to do better going forward. We can't erase the damage that was done at the beginning, and that will be measured forever in lost lives. But going forward, we can do better. With the production of vaccines, as David was saying, we have the capacity to produce more than you need in the United States. And we can work with other countries of the world to make sure that it's available and that the process of distributing it is handled in a cooperative way through bilateral and multilateral arrangements. We know how to do that. And that's something that if we do it a year from now, I think the world will be better for it. Right now, we're seeing, I think, dangerous drift towards kind of vaccine diplomacy, if you want to call it diplomacy, where it's an attempt to develop spheres of influence by who you help get the vaccine. That's not a great thing. We should be talking to China about how do we do it together, not having it be who gets it from us, who gets it from China. That doesn't mean we don't have serious issues with China. We do. But on dealing with a global pandemic, we ought to be able to do better. And it's the two largest countries in the world. It will fall more to us in China than other countries. But I think that there's the capacity to come out of this, finding ways to work collectively on transnational problems where it's in each of our individual as well as collective interests, because we're safer when other people are treated and are vaccinated. And the world is a better place when there's a sense that the powerful and richer countries of the world or worrying about the countries that don't have the ability to deal with it on their own. I don't think what I just said is pie in the sky. I actually think, if we were in a negative space in the first year on this, we can be in a very positive space in the year going forward.
That's great. So just for the last question, bring it back to Newton, where this all began. And frankly, this relates not just to Newton, but to our lives today. So I love this question. I think Stefan, David, whoever wants to jump in. Steve asks, didn't Newton make most of his amazing discoveries while working at home during a pandemic during this time? So we're all hoping to be, more erudite in our home offices here. Can you comment on Newton's?
Again, it wasn't his home office. It was outside in nature. So it was during a pandemic, but it was the notion of nature. If you tell kids, I want you to run around and then take an aptitude test. They do about 18% better than kids who are sitting before they take a test. But and that's running indoors. You then have them run outdoors in nature. It's a 26% improvement in cognitive function as measured by an aptitude test by running around in nature. Our brain was wired to be able to live with the colors that are in nature, the images that are in nature, and we need to respect that. And Newton obviously goes back and tells us what can happen and be possible. Even in the most devastating of times, and even being isolated, we can make an impact in the world.
That's a great place to end. It's 1:30. Thank you to our fantastic speakers, panelists. It's really a privilege to have you as partners in moving the library forward. I want to remind everyone that this is the launch of a new series, and our next NLI USA Signature Speaker Series will be on April 22nd, where we will have Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer and Middle East expert David Makovsky for an insider view of peace with Bahrain, Morocco, and the UAE. They will be joined by Raquel Yukilis from the library, our lead curator. And it should be a fantastic event. You'll be getting information about that, but mark your calendars for April 22nd, again at 12:30. I invite you to complete a survey after this talk, and if you would like to support the library, please do. If you want to learn more, feel free to email me. My email's in the chat. And again, thank you very, very much. And I hope you're all well in the pandemic.
Thank you so much,
Dina. Thank you all for being with us.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye, everybody. Great to see you. Thank you, friends, for coming.